Minasan konnichiwa. Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. During summer months, Japan experiences the rainy season in June and July when water level surges in rivers and canals in big cities. This comes right after the cherry blossom when Japan turns into a beautiful garden and the rain comes to take the flower petals away. During this deluge and chaos of the rainy season, in 1948, a man and a woman drowned in a Tokyo canal. Their bodies were not discovered until almost a week later. This made the headlines in Japan. The mystery of their death was sensational news because the man was one of the most famous writers and a huge celebrity at the time. The cause of their death remained a mystery at the time, and newspapers speculated many things. But the truth was far from hidden, because the man had already written a book revealing all the secrets. Published posthumously, this novel is considered one of the most disturbing novels, and it made the man not only one of the most famous Japanese writers of all time, but also revealed what was going on inside the man's head. Now we begin to understand the man himself and the cause of his death. In this video, I'll answer the following questions. Why is this novel considered the most disturbing novel? What makes it disturbing? And why is it still one of the most popular novels in Japan? And why are the Japanese youth so interested in this novel? But first, what led one of the most famous Japanese writers to die at the height of his success? While it's fictionalized by the man himself, it's pretty much the biography of the tormented man himself. No Longer Human's original title in Japanese is Ningen Shikaku. Ningen means human and Shikaku means disqualified or incapacitated or eliminated. Therefore, it's also translated as a shameful life. The protagonist, Yozo Oba, narrates his own story by writing 3 notebooks that include 3 photos of the man himself. That's all we have, 3 pictures and 3 notebooks. The first notebook is about his early childhood growing up in a wealthy household in the north of Japan. The second notebook is about his life at university in Tokyo, and the third one is about after he's expelled from university until he disappears completely. From a very young age, Yozo realizes a simple fact. He thinks he doesn't belong to the society he lives in. He feels like an imposter or a runaway child who happens to live among another tribe. In order to survive in this tribe, he must pretend. He must fake it to make it. Dazai himself was born in 1909 into a wealthy land-owning family in the northern region of Tofuku in Aomori Prefecture. However, his father was a member of parliament, so he was mostly in Tokyo. His mother suffered from illness, so Dazai was raised by the family's servants. As we will see, Yozo and Dazai have a very similar life, so the novel is mostly autobiographical. One day, while watching his politician father giving a speech, Yozo hears his father's colleague criticizing him behind his back for a small mistake he made in his speech. But in front of him, they say nothing. He realizes a profound fact that in order to survive among humans, one must put on masks. While in The Catcher in the Rye, Holden refuses to join the phony grown-up world, but Yozo accepts the social fakery. Yozo has 2 masks, obedience and comedy. First, he does what others ask him to do, not to rock the boat, so to speak. Second, he acts like a clown, so nobody takes him seriously. Since Yozo's entire life is an act, therefore his deepest and darkest fear is that someone might unmask him. Imagine growing up as a young boy, burdened by the fact that you have this terrible secret. 2 incidents shake him deeply. Once in school, while jumping during a PE class, he falls down on purpose to make others laugh. But one of the boys, Takaichi, sees through the fake fall. Afraid his secret might be revealed, he becomes friends with Takaichi, who introduces him to Vincent van Gogh, an artist with a troubled soul. For a while, art becomes his Freudian catharsis, just as Dazai took up writing to express his inner demon. Dazai was heavily drawn to the short stories of Akutagawa and Dostoevsky, as well as bunraku, Japanese puppet shows. Takaichi, the boy who almost unmasked him, opened the world of art to Yuzo, which was a blessing in disguise. Yuzo hates anything that has a purpose. He's drawn to art because he considers it without any material utility. Growing up privileged, he was always told to eat at certain times. He never saw food as a human necessity. So at one point, he says that he cannot understand the purpose of eating. He says, quote, "Mine has been a life of much shame. I can't even guess what it must be to live the life of a human being. I was born in a village in the northeast, and it wasn't until I was quite big that I saw my first train. I climbed up and down the station bridge quite unaware that its function was to permit people to cross from one track to another. I was convinced that the bridge had been provided to lend an exotic touch and to make the station premises a place of pleasant diversity, like some foreign playground. I remained under this delusion for quite a long time, and it was for me a very refined amusement indeed to climb up and down the bridge. I thought it was one of the most elegant services provided by the railways. When later I discovered that the bridge was nothing more than a utilitarian device, I lost all interest in it." The second incident that shakes Yuzo is at a police station when the officer asks him if his coughing blood is fake. Both incidents are incredibly frightening for him. He says that those two incidents were the scariest moments of his life, so he always lives in fear. Quote, "The more I feared people, the more I was liked, and the more I was liked, the more I feared them, a process which eventually compelled me to run away from everybody." Yuzo becomes withdrawn, and so does Dazai, who lost his father at a young age, but the death of Akutagawa in 1927, when Dazai was 18, was far more devastating, so much so that he attempts to end his life but was unsuccessful. This was his first attempt. As a young man, Yuzo heads to Tokyo to study at Tokyo University, just like Dazai himself in 1930. While at Tokyo, he has some freedom from his family's servants. One of his classmates in art class introduces him to alcohol. Not only that, he also discovers sex and politics. Dazai too was addicted to women, nice clothes, alcohol, and the Communist Party. But Dazai eloped with a geisha girl, which resulted in him being kicked out of university. Yuzo divides his time between chasing prostitutes and attending underground communist meetings. In reality, he doesn't care for either because both leave him empty at the end. Inside the Communist Party, he rises up the ranks quickly simply because he does what he is told to do. In other words, he's a perfect cog in this machine. At some point, he decides he has had enough. He convinces a barmaid to drown together. Just as it happened to Dazai, the woman dies in Kamakura while Yuzo survives with enormous guilt. Just like Dazai himself, Yuzo is arrested, but due to his family's enormous political influence, he is released from prison. But despite avoiding prosecution, he is immediately kicked out of university. He meets another woman called Shizuko, a single mother, and they start living together. To avoid further scandal for the family, Yuzo is persuaded to marry the single mom. He says yes, but in Yuzo's life, everything is fake. Now he assumes to play the role of not just a husband, but also a father to her child. Perhaps now this responsibility of being a father to a child can give him a purpose? The answer is no. Old habits return. He spends his days drawing cartoons for the newspaper, and at night he drinks and womanizes like there's no tomorrow. His days and nights spill over each other. He draws pictures of naked women and copies the poetry of Omar Khayyam underneath. Khayyam was writing centuries ago about life being too short, so you might as well drink and have fun as a kind of rebellion against strict religious authorities. But for Yuzo, it has dire consequences. Later, Yuzo meets a young lady called Yoshiko, a virgin woman who is extremely innocent and trusting, the total opposite to Yuzo, who trusts nobody. You could say a perfect match. Things are looking up for Yuzo. He's finally happy. But his past catches up to him. An old friend, a former classmate, the man who introduced him to the hedonistic life of drinking and womanizing, comes to visit him. While Yoshiki is downstairs cooking a meal for them, the two men are upstairs catching up. They talk about life, art, and of course literature. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment comes up. This is an ominous sign that something terrible is about to happen. But Yozo is totally oblivious. He's finally happy thanks to Yoshiko. His heart is filled with love, but his friend is a different beast. Next thing you know, his friend goes downstairs and sexually assaults Yoshiko. Yozo is devastated. It was his fault for letting the man get close to Yoshiko. His guilt is enormous. This incident prompts him to end his life for the second time, but he fails once again. Speaking of being a loser who cannot succeed in anything, at the hospital he discovers a miracle drug, morphine. We know where that ends. He ends up in a mental asylum. After a while, he's taken up by his brother to a remote countryside. We don't know what happened to him there, but we know how he feels about life. By the end of the novel, he is 27 years old, but he thinks he looks like he's 40. We don't know what happens to him at the end. There are no more notebooks from Yozo, so it can only mean one thing. Perhaps he's no longer around. The no longer human is no longer. We know what happened to Dazai himself. Before this novel was published, he drowned himself, so now we have a better understanding of the man himself. So by writing this novel before his death, Dazai basically tells his own story of a tormented life. Now, what makes the novel so disturbing, or is it really disturbing, and why is it still one of the most read novels in Japan, especially among the Japanese youth? While the novel makes no mention of politics of the time, one cannot help associate the theme of the novel to the state of affairs in Japan under the US occupation from 1945 to 1954, after a humiliating defeat in which the Japanese were the first and only victims of nuclear bombs in human history. The novel came out in 1948, the same year that Dazai killed himself, and it was a success because it captured the mood of a nation utterly defeated and subjugated by their enemies. One of the most common themes in Japanese literature is loneliness. A country with about 120 million people is perhaps the loneliest country in the world. Isolated from its neighbors through bodies of water on all sides, speaks a language that nobody else speaks, practices Shintoism, a religion that nobody else practices, ethnically unrelated to any other countries, and culturally extremely unique. Not only the country is isolated, but the people are too. Among the Japanese, social interactions are extremely regimented. You only talk to people if you have a genuine reason or relationship. Casual interactions with strangers rare. Most Japanese people, especially young, live in one-bedroom apartments. Marriage rate is falling. Birth rate is falling. A nation of 128 million some 15 years ago is now 123 million. It is estimated that by the end of this century, Japan will have 73 million people. So it's no surprise that loneliness is one of the most common themes in Japanese literature. Through the influence of Chinese philosopher Confucius, individualism is not promoted. Yozo tried his best to fit in through comedy as well as through duty, but it came at a cost. He wasn't himself. He was acting, pretending, and faking it. It takes a toll after a while. Also, you're always in fear of being found out, your true persona. Hiding it leads Yozo to paranoia that somebody someday might discover him. He tried art as a cure, painting portraits, cartoons, but art too failed to give him a proper purpose in life. Instead, he fell for short-term hedonistic pleasures. He found women, alcohol, and drugs as quick solutions to his inner miseries. Women as a savior of fallen men is prominent in Dostoevsky's works, and here too we see a few times women came to rescue Yozo, but his relationships with women are not great. At times he loves them, but then he realizes that men and women are vastly different. For example, in this quote, "I have always found that the female of the human species is many times more difficult to understand than the male. In my immediate family, women outnumber the men. I think it'll be no exaggeration to say that my only playmates while I was growing up were girls." Nevertheless, it was with very much the sensation of treading on thin ice that I associated with these girls. I could almost never guess their motives. I was in the dark. At times I made indiscreet mistakes which brought me painful wounds. These wounds, unlike the scars from the lashing a man might give, cut inwards very deep, like an internal hemorrhage, bringing intense discomfort. Once inflicted, it was extremely hard to recover from such wounds. Yuzo says that men inflict physical pain while women inflict emotional pain. For example, the same woman would throw him under the bus in front of others, but later in private, hug him. Another example is when he was clowning himself, men would laugh at him for a short while. Women, however, would nudge and prod him to continue making jokes, and they would continue laughing, which led him to conclude that women's desire for excitement had no limit. One of the biggest ironies in the story is that despite his negative views of women, they fall for him. Perhaps these women saw this miserable man as a project. I should also point out that Yuzo is a good-looking man, another reason women were attracted to him. He's no different than a stray cat in the park, and many women feed them and look after them. Every time he's rescued by a woman, just like a wild cat, he goes astray. Apart from sex, alcohol, and drugs, Yuzo also dabs into politics. Just like Dostoevsky, who joined a radical left-wing group in his youth before his Siberian experience, Yuzo too joins a communist circle. The novel is mainly set in the early 1930s when Japan was going through a rapid westernization and imperial expansion. The old and the new felt like a mismatch for many young writers, including Dazai, Akutagawa, and Mishima. In the same way, a century earlier, for the first generation of Russian writers like Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, and to some extent Dostoevsky, wrote against the westernization of Russia. While Dazai's novels and stories may sound depressing, reading him is somewhat uplifting at times. First, his style of writing is very relatable, as most of his writing is in a diary form. It's like we are reading someone's most private thoughts and feelings, confessions, vulnerabilities, and weaknesses. We sympathize with his characters and we relate with them. This makes us feel not alone. We feel we understand Yuzo's pains, and that makes us less lonely. Even to this day, Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human has remained one of the most popular novels in Japan, especially among the youth. Recently, a manga artist, Junji Ito, adopted it into a best-selling manga, which stretches it into 3 volumes, while also reducing a literary philosophical novel into a horror story. The reason the novel is still hugely popular among the Japanese youth is that it captures not only the loneliness of the youth, but also the transition from childhood to adulthood, when we realize the true nature of the world. When our myths are busted, when our innocence is shattered, and our childhood is over. Most of us survive to become adults and have kids of our own to relive the magic of childhood through them, and then, if lucky, to experience that through our grandkids. But for a small group of people like Yuzo, this transition from childhood to adulthood is too traumatic that it damages them for life. Once their eyes are opened, they are unable to accept life's many contradictions. Dazai ends the novel on a somewhat positive note, which is also a Buddhist philosophy and deeply Japanese way of thinking. Quote, "Now I have neither happiness nor unhappiness. Everything passes. That's the one and only thing that I have thought resembled a truth in society of human beings, where I have dwelled up to now as in burning hell. Everything passes." The novel is very profound that it makes sadness beautiful. Just as cherry blossoms evoke sadness, one moment it illuminates the entire neighborhood, the next moment you see it dancing in the wind before tumbling on the pavement or into canals. Tamagawa Aqueduct in Tokyo, where Dazai died, is filled with cherry blossom trees. Cherry blossom is the metaphor for the impermanence of life. Dazai blossomed in his novel for sure. Arigatou gozaimasu. Please leave a comment or a like and share among your friends. Thank you very much.